Here. This is another section of Misery Loves Company. This sequence is going to be called Eros and Spice, Extending the Honeymoon. Now, last time we noted in passing a couple of things that I want to come back to, and these are pretty interesting things in their own fashion. 4 plus 9, 33. One was things on the internet, which I wanted us to look at as phenomena, not judging them. And in fact, if we want to be, shall we say, scientific and spiritual about things, we have to recognize that that antipathy and sympathy needs to be dealt with as well. That we can't just sort of look at porn or romanticism or whatever it is, the differences between men and women, the differences between you and your partner, as if some kind of flaw exists. It's part of the nature of reality. Now, I showed you a paper like this before. You know, this is called The Total Human Organization as an Instrument of Love. And then before we talked about the threefold structure, which was spirit, soul, and body. Now we're going to look at what's called the fourfold structure a little bit. You know, we're going to try to use that vocabulary because it's helpful. And in this, instead of spirit, we talk about the ego or the I or the warmth body. Instead of soul, we talk about the desire or the astral body, and we include with this a little bit something that could be called the ethereal or the life forces body. And then, of course, spirit, soul, and body, we have the physical or material body. Now let's review a little bit something that we went over before. You're lying down in the bed with your partner and you're stroking them on the back. And you're experimenting with different kinds of touch. You know, sometimes you just one finger, and sometimes you're massaging them, and maybe you just run your hand over because there's pleasure to your hand to stroke them that way. You can do all these different kinds of things, and you can ask your partner what they like and what they don't like. And remember that the skin is this incredibly huge sense organ, and it's one of the reasons that we have as aspects of Eros the erotic and the sensual, because the whole body is covered with skin. And what do we do when we make love? We take our clothes off because we want as much contact as possible. Okay, so the ego or warmth body, the desire or astral body, the ethereal life forces body, and the physical or material body. And the direction of this particular sequence of talks is about spice and extending the honeymoon. Now, most couples and most of our general understanding of what goes on in the couples talks about this period that's called the honeymoon, and then after a while we've been around a person, and that excess of sympathy we talked about before, where love is blind, we all of a sudden aren't blind anymore, and we start to recognize that this person that we've married or whatever has a dark side. And of course, some of the best advice on the planet in terms of dealing with the existence of the dark side is actually not to focus on the other person. I mean, that's where Christ begins the Sermon on the Mount. It talks about the mote and the beam, and says that we really need to understand the beam in our own eye, which is our own dark side, our own judgmentalism, before we can begin to understand the flaw that we perceive in the other, in the thou. In a way, being part of a couple is to also be part of a process of spiritual development or maturation. You know, most people who get married and most people who have children will be able to reflect back on it, you know, if it wasn't too traumatic in various kinds of ways and didn't result in explosion or all kinds of dire things, all of which are possible. But people can grow together or they can grow apart, and different kinds of things can happen. And I'm just, you know, giving out general statements which have the flaws of all general statements, which is when you apply them in practice to a particular thing, they don't quite fit. They're not so much true with regard to an individual, but they're kind of a truism, which means they're useful when you want to think about things. So these general ideas are at that level of thinking. They are to help us, you know, at night, let's say, if you're in an active partnership and you are trying to develop the emollient forces of Eros, the forces that reduce conflict by confession and contrition at night. You know, these are just daily practices that help people live together, because life rubs us raw and we rub each other raw. And in fact, one of the reasons there's a lot of fighting that goes on between couples is that they bring feelings from their employment life that they can't satisfy there, you know. The wife goes to work and she's sexually abused, or she's in an environment, you know, or sexually harassed, or she's in an environment where men are pigs toward her, and she has to endure that. You know, and she comes home, and if her significant other is piggish because he's a man with her, that's a hot button, right? That's a wound. She carries that wound. And a similar kind of thing for a man. He'll have self-esteem issues in his job. He wants to be recognized in his job. And he probably has wounds from when his mother didn't recognize him. You know, and so that is part of why he tries to turn his wife into a mother, and part of why women turn into mothers with their husbands, because this is a fallback position that sort of you're able to go in. But here we're talking about sort of waking up to those dynamics. At the end of the day, you talk about them and you take some of the sting out of them and you grow, and that's the whole purpose of these dialogues, is to give people a vocabulary that's useful and helps them develop. Okay, that's the point. We want development. We want to create in the future, in the dynamics of the basic ordinary relationships, out of the forces that are now returning to humanity from the direction of unfallen Eros, from the redemption of Eros, from raising it up out of the confusion in which it fell during this time of general paternalism in Western civilization. And we don't do that on a massive scale by passing a law. We do that on a one-to-one scale in our relationships. We do it right where it needs to happen, where the most important, poignant points are. Gotta pause.